A few years ago, while I was working at the United States Department of Homeland Security, my principal job was to travel around the globe to coordinate anti-terrorism activities with other nations. One of the places that I visited most frequently was Germany. Germany is a critical partner in our counterterrorism efforts. At least in part, this is because it is a significant transit point for traffic between the Middle East and other parts of the world. But it's also because Germany is one of the most able partners America has in the European Union. The Germans, with 80 million people and a vigorous economy, are capable of significant assistance when they are inclined to provide it. But that was the confounding thing. It was always difficult for me to understand the Germans. To my mind, they seemed to be the Europeans who were most like Americans, good-natured, effective, willing to work hard. They sort of reminded me of Texans. At the same time, they were unwilling or unable to use those capabilities in the way we wanted to fight the terrorist activities that we were seeing. In particular, their attitude was very different than Americans' views on how to conduct surveillance and about when they would be willing to share information they collected with anyone outside of the German government. There were clearly positive benefits to enhanced information sharing between the United States and Germany, but the Germans were simply unwilling to change their practices. They explained this to me as a legacy of their own history. If I heard it once, I heard it a dozen times, that Germany had been ruled by not one, but two authoritarian regimes in the previous 50 years. Adolf Hitler and then communist East Germany. In those regimes, the Germans had seen the dangers of pervasive government surveillance, and they were very reluctant to go back down that road again. Now, it's one thing for them to express that fear of the surveillance state, which is visceral and embedded. I could grasp why history would shape their sensitivity. But I didn't really understand until I saw the movie The Lives of Others. It's a beautiful film that won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Movie. It tells a story about Stasi surveillance in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you've never seen it, I recommend you do so. It brings home why surveillance really matters. Broadly, the movie is about a German intelligence officer who is ordered to conduct surveillance on a well-to-do German couple. The man is a playwright and the woman is an actress. This order is handed down to the intelligence officer, not because the couple is suspected of disloyalty or espionage, but rather because a member of the Communist Party is interested in the girlfriend. The communist official wants the intelligence agency to discover something bad about the boyfriend so he can have his way with the girlfriend. And the story is about how the act of surveillance affects not only the boyfriend and girlfriend who became aware of it, but also about how being a watcher changes the intelligence agent himself and transforms him. It's an amazingly powerful revelation. Just as importantly, the movie preserves for us an insight into what the Stasi culture was like. And that's the subject of today's lecture. I want to first talk about the Nazi precursor to the Stasi system, then we'll describe how Stasi surveillance functioned. We will also close with a short consideration of why, if at all, the Stasi history is relevant to contemporary debates. Prior to the Cold War standoff between Eastern and Western Europe, there was, of course, significant state surveillance in Germany during the Nazi regime leading up to and throughout World War II. The author, Erik Larson, describes the problem in his book In the Garden of Beasts. Set during the early years of the Nazi government, it's about the life and times of America's ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, and the Dodd family, who lived in Germany during the early and mid-1930s. The book is based on Dodd's own diary, that of his flighty daughter Martha, and the abundant wealth of diplomatic cables that went back and forth from the Berlin embassy to the Department of State headquarters in Washington. As Larson tells the story, Dodd and his family were acutely aware of widespread Nazi surveillance. Prevailing wisdom held that Nazi agents hid their microphones in telephones to pick up conversations. To overcome any snooping, Larson says, the ambassador filled a cardboard box with cotton and used it to cover his own telephone whenever a conversation in the library shifted to confidential territory. Larson also relates the anecdote about the man who telephones a friend and in the course of the conversation happens to ask, "How's Uncle Adolf?" Somehow, afterward, the secret police appear at his door and insist that he prove he really has an Uncle Adolf. And the question was not a coded reference to Hitler. Larson says Germans began looking over their shoulders at every encounter and came to practice what became known as the German glance, a quick look in all directions when encountering a friend or acquaintance on the street. Quote, "In the most casual of circumstances," he writes, "you spoke carefully and paid attention to those around you, and in a way you never had before." Nazi surveillance was undergirded by one of the most sophisticated data collection and analysis systems of the time. It was possibly the first systematic use of data balance by a nation-state. The system was developed and operated by a company known as DEHOMAG, the corporate acronym for, and here, let me apologize to any listeners who are native German speakers for my horrible pronunciation, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft, MBH. In English, that means German Hollerith Machine LLC. DEHOMAG was a subsidiary of the U.S. technology company IBM. It had a monopoly on data analysis for the German government in the years leading up to and during World War II. The Hollerith in the name was Hermann Hollerith, a German-American inventor who developed a method for instructing the analog data accumulators of that era through the use of punch cards. If, by the way, you're too young to have seen a punch card, they were pieces of stiff paper in which holes were punched in predetermined positions. The holes could either control the machine, telling it what function to perform, or they could contain data that would be used in performance of that function. Hollerith first invented and used his data punch cards to capture the data for the 1890 U.S. Census. He founded the Tabulating Machine Company in 1896, which in 1924 became known as the International Business Machines Corporation, or IBM. During the Nazi era, IBM punch cards were used to compile data on Jewish citizens in Germany as part of the German census. According to Edwin Black, writing in the New Yorker magazine, quote, "One series of punch cards were designed to record religion, national origin, and mother tongue, but by creating special columns and rows for Jew, Polish language, Polish nationality, the fur trade as an occupation, and then Berlin, Nazis could quickly cross-tabulate at the rate of 25,000 cards per hour exactly how many Berlin furriers were Jews of Polish extraction. Railroad cars could take 2 weeks to locate and route, and now could be swiftly dispatched in just 48 hours by means of a vast network of punch card machines. Indeed, IBM services coursed through the entire German infrastructure in Europe." Close quote. IBM disputes some of what Black has written, particularly with regard to their motivations, but it does not dispute the fundamental point that its technology was a component of Nazi surveillance capability. Against this background, it's easy to see how surveillance came to pervade communist East Germany after World War II, and why contemporary Germans so highly value privacy and limits on state surveillance. The internal security force for the German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany, was known as the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, MFS, commonly known as the Stasi. Many commentators describe it as the most repressive and oppressive surveillance system ever operated. One of my favorite stories about Stasi surveillance is told by the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. Early in her career, shortly after interviewing for a job as a scientific assistant at an East German university, apparently she was approached by the Stasi and asked to be an informant for the state. She says she turned down the offer and got off by explaining that she was a blabbermouth who couldn't keep her mouth shut. It's a wonderful story, especially since she became known as a very closed-mouthed leader of one of Europe's most important countries. Now, here are some, though by no means all, of the activities that the Stasi undertook during its heyday. It had, of course, a system for monitoring telephone conversations. It also had what is known as a mail cover system that opened up letters and parcels coming in from overseas, as well as mail to certain targeted people. It tracked all of the few foreigners who were allowed into East Germany. And perhaps my favorite was a division whose job it was to detect whether any citizens had illegal Western foods in their garbage. The Stasi even took odor samples to enrich their files on suspects. If you go to the Stasi Museum today, you can see them. Rows of jars with yellow cloth inside. The Stasi systematically and secretly collected the smells of suspected dissidents for use as a comparison. For example, dogs might compare the smell on a flyer for a protest meeting against the smell from a suspected organizer. When in 2007, the current German government did something similar, collecting scent samples from protesters at a G8 meeting, the reaction was, as you would expect, quick and decidedly negative. Here's one more example of how Stasi surveillance worked. The German news magazine Der Spiegel once reported how a nosy Hausfrau, who had been asked by her neighbors to water their plants while they were away, went snooping through their cupboards and found the makings for a delicious, and by standards of austere East Germany, lavish West German pudding. Once the nosy neighbor informed state security, that was enough for the family breadwinner to be fired from his job and for the entire household to plunge into destitution. The Stasi's most insidious characteristic was not its army of civil servants. Rather, what distinguished Stasi from other surveillance systems was the massive number of its informants, the company of whom Chancellor Merkel wisely chose not to join. In Germany, they were known as informal collaborators, or inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, IMs. Though estimates vary, we can say with confidence that in 1989, on the cusp of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the East German government employed more than 170,000 of these IMs. When you consider that the entire population of the country was only 16 million at the time, this means that more than 1% of the population served as informants. And if you exclude the very young and the very old from the population, it is likely that as many as 2% of the population of adult age were IMs. Perhaps worst of all, some 10,000 of these informants were under the age of 18. They were children, many of them perhaps spying on their parents. I've seen one estimate in John O. Kohler's book, Stasi, The Untold Story of the East German Secret Police, suggesting that if occasional informants are included, as many as 2 million East Germans were watching their fellow citizens. If true, such a number surely validates Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal's belief that the Stasi were even more oppressive than the Nazi Gestapo. Using Wiesenthal's figures for the Nazi Gestapo during World War II, there was one officer for every 2,000 German citizens. By comparison, according to John Kohler, the ratio for the Stasi was one secret policeman per 166 East Germans. When the regular informants are added, there would have been at least one spy watching every 66 citizens. And when one adds in the estimated number of part-time snoops, like the plant-watering neighbor, the result is nothing short of monstrous. One informer per 6.5 citizens. Again, there is some historical dispute. Some German researchers think Kohler's numbers are exaggerated. But even if we don't count the informants, the Stasi workforce was larger on a per capita basis than the Gestapo or the Soviet KGB. One of the most insidious forms of Stasi surveillance went by the name Zersetzung. Zersetzung was, broadly speaking, a form of psychological harassment that was designed to wreak havoc on an individual without any need to arrest or torture the target. As the German historian Hubertus Knabe puts it, the word is difficult to translate because it means originally biodegradation, but actually it's quite accurate a description. The goal was to destroy secretly the self-confidence of people, for example, by damaging their reputation, by organizing failures in their work, and by destroying their personal relationships. Considering this, East Germany was a very modern dictatorship. The Stasi didn't try to arrest every dissident. It preferred to paralyze them, and it could do so because it had access to so much personal information and to so many institutions. What would some of these techniques be? How did they work? Well, as Knabe mentions, some of them were semi-overt. The Stasi would arrange, for example, for your work to go poorly. Though the causes might not be known to the subject of the attack, the effects were pretty evident. Other techniques were more insidious. It would sometimes, for example, spread rumors about a target amongst his or her friends and colleagues, stories of alcoholism, parental neglect, or the like. Sometimes, the Stasi would play mischievous mind games with the target. They might, for example, enter his or her house and move the furniture around. Or they might change the time on an alarm clock, or replace the tea bags with different types of tea. Talk about messing with your mind. Other tactics were similarly abusive. Reports exist of the Stasi arranging for a target to get deliberately incorrect medical treatment, or to receive doctored photographs purporting to show him in a compromising position. One report, perhaps apocryphal, has the Stasi sending a vibrator to the wife of the target of one of their operations, evidently as a way of sending a message about his lovemaking. Why use Zersetzung? For any number of reasons. First and foremost, there is the in terrorem effect of the technique. The victim doesn't know what's happening. The mystery makes the adverse situation all the more difficult, and everybody around the target can watch as he or she crumbles under the relentless pressure of state harassment. Think of the psychological effects such a pervasive system must have had on the population. Think of the times that a German citizen was convinced that the person on the train next to him was a government agent, and yet that fear was purely in his head. It speaks to the paranoia that builds up once you start to think that some enormous, invisible, sinister organization is out to get you. Against our real adversaries, that sense of dread is very effective. We want Al-Qaeda to think we know more about them than we actually do. And in an authoritarian state like East Germany, it is a wonderfully effective means of control. But in a democracy like America, it is a serious problem when your own citizens develop that same sense of dread. And it's nearly impossible to erase once started. Second, Zersetzung is efficient. Holding someone in a cell is expensive. Harassing them every third day is much less so. And it is effective. Finally, an added advantage of psychological operations was their deniability. The Stasi could plausibly say it had no idea about what was happening, and thereby allow the East German regime to maintain a false facade of international respectability. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Stasi tried to destroy many of its files. They were thwarted only when East German citizens stormed the offices and stopped them from expunging the records. Perhaps only 10% of the records were destroyed. Nobody knows for sure. How large is the file system that remains? According to the German magazine Der Spiegel, the surviving files occupy more than 100 kilometers, roughly 62 miles of shelf space. In addition, there are 16,000 sacks of shredded documents that some are trying to reconstruct. That's a huge record of human conduct, from the trivial, like the illegally hoarded West German pudding, to the significant. On the other hand, not everybody was in the system. Since the fall of the wall, nearly 3 million Germans have asked to see their files. And somewhat surprisingly, roughly 50% of those who made the request come away disappointed. They don't have a file on record with the Stasi. I suppose that's fundamentally a good thing, but we can also imagine a certain frisson of disappointment. Was I not important enough to be subject to surveillance? The Stasi system was not the only one of its kind. Chinese surveillance, what little is known of it, looks very much like that employed by the Stasi. Today, for example, it is standard practice for American businesses to warn their traveling employees not to take along their personal electronics and to destroy the phones they do take along before returning to the United States. Consider as well the story of Hao Jian, an activist who was part of the Tiananmen Square protests. One of his friends who gave a speech in the United States says that Hao, who is not allowed to leave China, has his phone tapped by the police, that they read all of his email, and they follow him physically all the time. As one police officer told Hao, "To me, your life is totally transparent." Imagine what it must be like to be forced to lead a transparent life, one with no privacy at all. Indeed, the intelligence hierarchy in China is sufficiently obscure that almost nobody knows which agency is in charge of domestic surveillance, nor how many citizens are under scrutiny. Or take a walk in the shoes of Eric Talmadge, a reporter for the Associated Press in Tokyo, who covers North Korea. In recent years, he was the only Western reporter given regular access to North Korea. Talmadge told the Washington Post that when he is in Pyongyang, he is shadowed constantly by a minder, that is, someone who accompanies him every time he leaves his office or hotel. The minder seems to be more concerned with making sure that regular North Koreans don't talk to Talmadge than he is in watching Talmadge himself. When he goes out, Talmadge is not allowed to change his route or stop to interview people at random. And of course, everything he does electronically is monitored: his calls, his emails, and his internet use. Talmadge says, "I just assume that everything I say to anyone is on the record, always." At this point, now that we understand the Stasi system, it is fair to ask why, in a course on the modern surveillance state, we begin our discussion with consideration of the Stasi. After all, they've been gone more than 25 years. What does distant history have to do with today? I could defend the choice on any number of grounds. 25 years is not so long ago. American policy still revolves, in part, around events that occurred in the 1960s and 70s. So one answer is that a page of history is worth a volume of logic. Or as the writer and philosopher George Santayana once said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." On that basis alone, the history of one of the most intrusive surveillance systems ever is worth studying. But the better answer, I think, is that for good or ill, the Stasi system has become a sort of benchmark in political discourse for the description of systems of surveillance, and one that is deployed with some regularity. For example, Marcus Ferber, a member of Chancellor Angela Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, once assailed the United States for American-style Stasi methods. The Nation magazine has also bemoaned the United States as a modern-day Stasi state. And not long ago, in lights on the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, a German artist projected the message, United Stasi of America. So too, when President Obama defended previously undisclosed methods of the National Security Agency activity, he cited East Germany as a cautionary tale of what could happen when vast unchecked surveillance turned citizens into informers and persecuted people for what they said in the privacy of their own homes. Of course, he was using the Stasi as a counterpoint, answering accusations against the NSA by saying it was not a similarly vast, unchecked effort to collect data. Let's end this lecture by returning to one small factual detail from the movie The Lives of Others. It is a detail that remained true to life in East Germany up until the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. It was that month that East German officials opened the floodgates to allow citizens free passage to the West. It was the summer of 1990 when the wall began to be dismantled. In the film, one of the heroes, the playwright named Draiman, has become disillusioned with the communist state. He decides that he's going to write an expose about suicide in the East and have it smuggled to the West for publication. But Draiman has a problem. He needs a new typewriter. You see, it turns out that every typewriter in East Germany was registered with the government. Literally every typewriter was identified and associated with an owner, and the government had a sample of how the typeface of that particular writing machine looked. You can see the problem for Draiman. He's worried that were he to use his regular typewriter to write the story, and then somehow a copy of his manuscript came back to East Germany, it would be easy for the Stasi to pinpoint him as the author. So he solves the problem by having a friend smuggle in a new, unregistered typewriter to him from the West. And that's the typewriter he uses to write his explosive story. Later, the discovery of this secret typewriter forms a critical plot point of the movie, one that I won't spoil for you by telling. The innovativeness and poignancy of Draiman's resistance shouldn't obscure the broader point about the pervasiveness of Stasi surveillance. Among the many examples I've offered about surveillance in the former East German Stasi state, some comical, some quite chilling, for me, Draiman's typewriter is the zenith, or more appropriately, the nadir of the surveillance state. We can ask ourselves whether in its abusiveness, it has ever since been equal.